Okay, thank you. You've had a lot of talks so far today. You still don't hear. 1, 2, 1, 2. If I put it right, but then it gives the breath. I have to do it like this.
לא זה השני. כן, כן, זה בדיוק. ואז הוא לא יצטרך להחזיק.
Now? Oh, perfect. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. Nobody said that about me before. Okay. Maybe I just hold it in my hand, I mean, no. Now, you still can't hear me. No, it doesn't matter. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, still doesn't work. I'll hold it in my hand. Okay, fine. So I'm going to start from where I left my last paper, where I was saying, where I just introduced a theme. I didn't use the word militarization, but I was saying about the man having the emotional labor of taking, and so that's where I'm beginning. So the state of Israel is a fully militarized society, and has been so since its inception 70 years ago. Robbie Friedman's introduced the notion of a soldier matrix to help us think about this. And he says that every citizen is shaped in some way by the soldier matrix. But it is also the case that militarization fuels and furthers gender divides. The violence of the soldier, who is stereotypically male, exploits and reinforces the already existing structural violence of entrenched gender inequality. The military ideal and the masculinist ideal are one and the same. Both position the female as inferior to the male, both praise and foster the masculinist values of emotionless autonomy. But all modern states are militarized societies. Despite the absence of guns and soldiers in day-to-day life in the UK, British society is also highly militarized. To this day, British soldiers have been active on each and every day for the last many hundreds of years somewhere in the world. In a manner of speaking, the militarization of British society is more advanced than Israel's, in that it is better able to camouflage and sanitize its violence, particularly the violence it directs at its own citizens. India is also a militarized society, and although it is not apparent in its incense-filled ashrams, nor in its smog-filled bustling cities, India too has been on a continual war footing since independence, specifically in relation to Pakistan and China. Most recently, with Narendra Modi's Hindu fascists in control, the state has unleashed its military powers on its own people, sections of the population that happen to be Muslim, as well as those who dare to protest. I mention these two situations to make it clear that when referring to the Israeli context, I'm doing so in full knowledge that it is not the only society in which militarization problematizes the lives of its citizens. However, the context, form, and duration of Israel's overt militarization make it both raw and intense. The military, along with the kibbutz, have been one of the core elements of the identity of the Israeli nation. These two foundational pillars signify the sword and the plowshare, both of which are imbued with masculine meaning. Military service is, quote, a recognized right of passage to citizenship for Israeli Jews, a right that until recently the so-called Arab was excluded from. There are at least two forms of structural inequality in Israel, each producing its own form of violence. The first is culturally produced and has to do with women. The second is institutionalized in law and has to do with the Palestinian. And although distinct, the experience of one can often echo those of the other. In the few institutions that Palestinians and Jews do mix, Palestinians experience something like that of women in male-dominated organizations. You have the qualifications, but you are overlooked. You do the work, but then somebody else gets the credit. No grouping, Israeli, Palestinian, Jew or Arab, is ever homogeneous. There are always differences and conflicts. For instance, some have experienced the Israeli feminist movement as an Ashkenazi hegemony, in which Jewish women from the Mizrahi or Oriental background have felt alienated from. This is a class division, as historically Mizrahi Jews were economically disadvantaged relative to the Ashkenazim. It is also a race division, as Mizrahi Jews tend to be darker than the Ashkenazim. The sense of alienation was large enough for some Mizrahi women to experience a similarity between their disenfranchisement and those of Israeli Palestinian Arab women, so much so that in the early 1990s they made an alliance with them in order to challenge the Ashkenazi grouping that dictated the feminist agenda in Israel. It goes without saying that militarization has also been taking place in the regions that define themselves as Palestinian. And these regions too have been driven by lethal differences generated by internal power struggles between Hamas and the PLO, for example. This then is something of the contextual frame in which Israeli and Palestinian militarization has taken place. Militarization structures the lives and psyches of both women and men, but it does so asymmetrically. Militarization, being man's work, widens the divide between the genders and pushes the female gender towards more passive and traditional roles. I am mindful of the fact that in many regions, including Israel, women have also participated on frontline soldiering. In my view, the fact that women also soldier does not change the main thrust of what I'm going to put before you. This is because in these situations, the woman is living in accordance with the masculinist ideal, in which she has to show herself to be more of a man than men. Next, I want to argue that militarization has a very different consequence for the fate of women in Israeli contexts from those in Palestinian ones, because of the power differentials between them. Fundamentalist religion plays a significant role in both contexts, but in Israel there exist institutional democratic checks and balances that to some degree are able to hold back the fundamentalist tide. There is no such bulwark in destitute Palestinian regions. This has allowed political forces in Palestinian society to mobilize fundamentalist reading of Islam, to crush the green shoots of Palestinian feminism. But they are not entirely crushed, they are muted. And the muting has to do with the situation they find themselves in. Deutsch puts it succinctly. In the tension between national and gender identities, national identity tends to assume the greater importance. In contrast, Israeli women are able to be vocal. This difference gets misconstrued as arising out of cultural difference rather than political contingency. And because of this, Israelis can look down on their Arab sisters. For example, a Jewish woman in Bat Shalom saying, quote, "Some Arab women are too passive. They don't take things into their own hands." In his paper, Conflict and War, Robbie Friedman characterized the difference between Israeli and Palestinian women in a dialogue workshop in this way. Our women were very verbal and vocal professionals who certainly did more than half our talking. Conversely, their women did not talk for more than 10% of the Palestinian time allocation. In addition to the question of the male authority issue in Palestinian culture, I thought that in the Israeli subgroup, the female side had a strong influence on the negotiations, whilst the Palestinian subgroup, the women had no real impact. I was struck by two things in this passage. First, the implication that there is no male authority issue in Israel. And second, and more, that it is a problem for the Palestinians because of their culture. Second, the tone of voice, pride in our women and dismissive about theirs. What is not being considered are the reasons as to why the voices of Palestinian women are silent. In my view, they are silenced by two forces. First, by the patriarchal and religious authorities. But second, and more importantly, they decide to stay silent as a political strategy. They privilege the larger struggle for recognition over the struggle as women. Says one, I wait for the big conflict to end, and then my conflict will begin. Then I will open my mouth. I'll shout a year, 2 years, and if it's not solved, I'll make an intifada. A theme echoed by another Palestinian woman. Can you really talk about domestic violence before you talk about occupation? The more urgent thing, the thing that creates a condition for violence, is the occupation. If you condemn rape, you have to condemn the occupation, which is itself rape. The construal of Arab women as being somewhat useless and unable to contribute anything is an expression of ethnicism, which Coburn defines as this: the deployment of cultural markers to differentiate the group from others, and usually to flag up superiority over them. But in my view, ethnicism is just another name for racism. I do not dispute the fact that most Israeli women find them in a much better situation and are much more vocal than their Arab sisters, but I am disputing the culturist and ethnicist reasoning that is used to explain why this is the case. Oh, stop being such a girl, said to a boy. Or, he's being such an old woman, said about a man. Such insults are commonplace. To call a male female is an insult. To call a female male is to praise her. And this has been going on since time immemorial. Herodotus describes a female Greek general called Artemisia who allied with the Persian Emperor Xerxes and who was supposed to be very bold and brave and so on. And she's described as having manly courage. And Xerxes, who admired her, is reputed to have said, "My men have become women, my women men." And centuries later, the Roman Justin said of the same Artemisia, quote, that she was fighting with the greatest gallantry among the foremost leaders, so that you might have seen womanish fear in a man and manly boldness in a woman. In The Soldier's Matrix, Robbie Friedman describes a soldier's experience when required to charge into bullets. He says, although you would hope for all of them to get up immediately and run with you, there is usually only a little group of a few soldiers running on the front line. A so-called second row of comrades getting up more slowly will run behind you. There is also a third line, the group of soldiers who seem to have a hard time getting up. They follow at a distance. Now, although Friedman is saying nothing of the kind, convention would have it that the ones in the front line will be the ones who have manly boldness and manly courage, the real men. And I am entirely certain that I would find myself even further back behind the fourth group, full of womanish fear. When a woman is courageous, she's behaving like a man. When a man is cowardly, he is behaving like a woman. The gendered world order is unchanged. In his book called The Psychology of Military Incompetence, Dixon devotes an entire chapter to the ways in which the fear of being perceived as effeminate has played a part in military incompetence. In his view, The cult of manliness and toughness is a reaction against profound feelings of weakness out of an underlying fear of being seen as unmanly. And in order to be seen as manly, soldiers have been known to damage their ears whilst firing a cannon because they think it is sissy to wear ear protectors. This is also the case for men using pneumatic drills, digging roads in civilian life. The hidden reason, he says, for men wanting to keep women out of the military is not out of protectiveness. It has to do with the fact that the presence of women will, by association, emasculate those who normally fulfill those military roles. The fear of being seen to be feminine has resulted in a number of catastrophic consequences for the military. For example, in the First World War, hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping were lost by the British Navy's refusal to adopt the convoy system. This was because they had an irrational dislike of mothering a flock of ships. And when the USA joined the Second World War, they too... When the USA joined the Second World War, they too thought that escorting merchant ships was too effeminate a strategy. They pursued tactics which required aggressive masculinity embodied in so-called patrol and hunting operations. And the cost of this manly strategy was the regular monthly loss of over 500,000 tons of shipping and the loss of untold manly lives.
Are you familiar with the fact that
Yeah, that's a secret. In conflict situations, gender divisions are not only sexualized, they are also bolstered by sexism. Both are used to further specific political agendas. For example, men who stood in Israeli streets with the Women in Black peace movement were abused as effeminate faggots. Because they were standing with women, they were not real men, whilst the women themselves were subjected to sexualized insults such as traitors and Arafat's whores. In 2002, in the Indian state of Gujarat, there was a state-sponsored program supported by the current Prime Minister in which fascistic Hindu mobs murdered and raped over 2,000 ordinary Muslims. The violence was shocking, in part because it was so highly sexualized. Men goaded each other into action with taunts of effeminacy. And in its report, the International Initiative for Justice in Gujarat said that the sexual violence has been used as an engine of mobilization of hatred and destruction. The sheer trauma recounted by women, even 9 months after the violence, was overwhelming. And what's more, the panel found distressing evidence of Hindu women participating actively in the violence in Gujarat, inciting rape and murder. So the fact that Hinduvata women also inflicted sexualized violence on Muslim women gives me an opportunity to flag up two important issues. First, a clarification. Patriarchy is an ideology. In group analytic language, one could say that it structures the social unconscious. So ruling ideologies infiltrate the minds of all who inhabit the social spaces in which these ideologies rule. They normalize particular kinds of human relations. And as Elias and others have shown, both the oppressor and the oppressed are convinced by the truth of these ideological realities. So it should come as no surprise then that women, despite being oppressed by patriarchy, willingly participate in promoting and fostering a patriarchal worldview. The second thing is a caution, which was delivered by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, which he called the fallacy of the superior virtue of the oppressed. Because oppressors are baddies, we tend to think that the oppressed must be goodies. But it does not follow that persons who have been wronged can do no wrong and that they must always be in the right. In the UK, for example, a certain kind of white liberal finds it very difficult to dare to challenge a black person, in part because of a fear of being seen as racist, but in part because they imagine that the oppression has ennobled the black person. However, as the black American activist Dick Gregory once said, just being a Negro doesn't qualify you to understand the race situation any more than you being sick makes you an expert on medicine. So there is no possible ethical equation which legitimates the use of injuries done to us in the past to justify injuring others in the present. And this applies to all injured and oppressed groups, be they working class women, Tamils, Palestinians, Kashmiris, Bosnians, Jews, Muslims, blacks, and many others. New heading now, the purity of women. All nations require their inhabitants to subscribe to one or other form of nationalism and patriotism. And if you don't, you're called a traitor. You are supposed to love your country. The motifs of nationalism are always romantic. They draw on tropes of our land and our people, our history and our destiny, and ultimately on tropes of our purity. Often, this purity is said to be sanctified by God. Some citizens in Israel, the UK, Israel, and USA, UK, and Israel, and elsewhere regularly claim that their nation has been chosen by God to do his work. Within romantic discourses, women become emblematic of this purity and of the nation, which is usually called the motherland. Woman is elevated and her purity is linked to that of the nation. And so the purity of both feminine forms, woman and nation, have to be protected from defilement. The rhetoric of protection, a form of pseudo-benevolence, is used to mask the coercion and oppression of the citizen in general, and of women in particular. After all, it is said, it is for their own protection that women should remain in the home. It is why fathers should lock up their daughters, and why sons fight to preserve the virtue of their sisters. Symbolically, women are worshipped, but in actuality, they are simply property to be guarded. Ultimately, as men's lives are at the disposal of the nation, women's bodies are at the disposal of men. The patriarchal family, microcosm of the nation, governs women's behavior because only their sexual containment guarantees the purity of the bloodline and the honor of the family. All these dynamics get greatly amplified in times of actual conflict, in times of war. And to understand why and how this happens, it is helpful to recall the previous discussion on identity, in which I argued that our identity is always constituted out of a repudiated them. But mostly, identity is not a matter of choice. For example, many of those living in Bosnia did not think of themselves as Bosnians or Muslims or Christians. It was the Serbian genocidal assault on their secular cosmopolitan populations in Bosnia that led to them becoming fractured into mutually exclusive cultural conflictual identities. This is what Rada, a Yugoslavian living in Bosnia, had to say. All at once, I became a Serb. It was clear from my name that I was not a Muslim. So I didn't have to declare myself a Serb. People declared me. Meantime, masculinist identity comes into being by contrasting itself against a femininity that is pure, vulnerable, soft, and nurturing. The raison d'etre of muscular masculinity, the warrior, is founded in the belief that the male needs to be able to protect the nurturer woman that belongs to him. This is the rationale and justification for the necessity of muscular masculinity. This is why the capacity to wield sufficient power to protect our womenfolk becomes emblematic of real masculinity, the sign of being a proper man. However, the task of preserving the woman's purity also becomes the source of the warrior's vulnerability. The fact that he holds her symbolically, he holds her purity in such high regard is exactly why her defilement is so highly prized by the enemy, the ultimate form of which is rape, the most intimate and violent of intrusions, a travesty of intimacy. Well, the mass rape of women seems to be as old as warfare itself, even in biblical times. Zechariah and Isaiah both speak to the plunder and the taking and raping of women. Well, if women are property, then there is no difference between plunder and rape. Both are simply violations of property. The number of women that were abducted, tortured and raped by Pakistani forces in the Bangladeshi War of Independence in 1971 are thought to be something in the region of 500,000 women. A similar figure is cited for the number of Tutsi women raped, mutilated and killed by Hutus in Rwanda. Then there are the horrors that were inflicted by Serbian forces on Muslim women in Bosnia and so on. In each of these contexts, the mass use of rape as an instrument of war was sponsored and orchestrated by the state. The lives of women that physically survive rape are shattered, psychologically, physically, as well as socially, because now they are defiled and tarnished with shame. The males associated with them also feel tarnished, and so they shun them or even kill them. But although it is the women folk that have been so heinously injured, the real targets are the men that these women supposedly belong to. The aim is the destruction of the masculinist identity of the male warrior. He is humiliated, his honor and pride are destroyed, emasculated and feminized, he is man no more. Well, humiliation has been weaponized and turned into a tactical instrument of war. The target is the man, but the costs are being paid by the woman. When men feel humiliated, which they experience as an emasculation, they often remasculate themselves by attacking their own women. For example, there were reports of a sudden increase in incidents of domestic battering by Jewish men at home in Israel during the weeks of the Gulf War, when they were reduced to impotence as Scud missiles fell, required to sit passively at home while other men in armies exulted in retaliation. It is most important to underline the point that it is the patriarchal male world order which gives the rape of women these masculinist meanings and significances. But humiliation is also a tactic that is also employed in times of so-called peace. All across the world, state bureaucracies develop procedures that are supposedly in the service of efficiency or security or safety, but their real function is often that of control, coercion, and humiliation of other citizens by making their lives unnecessarily difficult or entirely impossible. Two examples from the UK. The first being the impossibly long and complicated 64-page benefit claims form that disabled people in the UK are required to fill in order to claim benefit. The second is the racist, hostile environment strategy initiated by the recent British Prime Minister, Theresa May, which was designed to make the lives of British citizens of colour so difficult they would be forced to leave and choose to leave. But Theresa May was not the first to think up this kind of strategy. There have been many others, one being in 1976 in Galilee, the Koenig Memorandum, which proposed that in order to Judaize Galilee, the state should make life unbearable for Palestinian Arabs and offer them incentives to leave. Something similar is taking place in India right now with Modi's implementation of a citizen law that is designed to explicitly exclude Muslims from citizenship. So whilst the policies of this Koenig Memorandum were never fully implemented in Galilee, its carbon copy was in the UK. Mrs. May's intention was exactly the same, to anglicize England. And even though the scandal was exposed, the practice continues under the auspices of our new racist Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. This is simply racism. Meanwhile, back in Israel, let us not forget the daily ritualized humiliations that are inflicted on Israeli Arabs at the checkpoints that they are forced to negotiate as they move from one zone to another. Humiliations that are legitimated as security measures. But is this not also racism? Vera Jordan, a former board member of Bat Shalom, found the suggestion that Israelis were also racist far too difficult, saying, "Introducing racism is provocative. Humanist Jews can't accept that nationalism is racism. For them, racism is what the Nazis did." Lao Tzu says in The Art of War, "Know your enemy." But in order to be able to kill or humiliate your enemy, it is important not to know them, because to know them is to know that they are human persons. One cannot injure persons without triggering ethical distress. I don't know if you've seen Ken Burns' very powerful documentary on Vietnam. And in that, a Vietnam vet says that during his time in Vietnam, he only ever killed one person, the first person. And that night, he was deeply troubled by the fact that he had killed an actual living, breathing person. He was overwhelmed with ethical distress. After that day, he only killed gooks, dinks, commies, and chinks. And he felt good about doing so because gooks were bad subhuman creatures and deserved to die. To destroy something bad is to do good. And because he is doing good, the soldier is likely to experience something one might call ethical euphoria rather than ethical distress. On the many occasions that soldiers do collapse having suffered ethical distress, the experience gets medicalized and sanitized as the mental disorder called PTSD. So I would modify Lao Tzu and say it is important to know that your enemy is not human. Well, societies organize themselves in ways that invisibilize its others in order not to register ethical distress. They become hidden in plain sight. As previously mentioned, this was the case with me in relation to the homeless. This kind of dynamic and capacity is commonplace, but it becomes particularly sharp in societies that embody conflict in one form or another. For example, we discovered that our friends, liberal white South Africans living in Johannesburg, and we discovered that despite having lived there their entire lives, they'd never set eyes on Soweto. The wife was the first to visit. And when she saw what she saw, she wept because she was overwhelmed by ethical distress. So even today in South Africa, whites live cheek by jowl with blacks and yet manage to know nothing about the conditions that their intimate others live in. Similarly, my family knows nothing about the realities of the poor Indians that clutter the streets and live in the ghettos there. Nor do I know much about the conditions of the holding centres in the UK that asylum seekers are locked up in for years at a time. I do know the conditions are so bad that many commit suicide. But like my South African friend, I don't know because somewhere I would rather truly not know because of the distress would be too disturbing to my comfortable life. I think something like this is also the case in Israel. I've understood that at a recent international workshop, a therapy workshop organized in Tel Aviv, there was the offer of a tour that would shed light on the day-to-day life of Palestinians in Jerusalem. Was it something about the principle of daring not to know that resulted in no Israeli group analyst taking up the invitation?
The Palestinians did not pick it up.
Okay. A later... Okay, I heard a different story. A later similar event, specifically for Israeli psychotherapists, did draw a significant number of participants. Perhaps we can take it up in discussion. I don't know if you would find yourself in agreement with an Israeli Jew, Lily, who said, quote, "The majority of Israeli Jews will only have spoken to an Arab man as his boss, and not at all to an Arab woman," unquote. Not true, no. Anyway. The blindness, however, I would say, is asymmetrical, patterned by the power relational field. For instance, Indian households know very little about the interests and desires and fears of the female servants that serve them. But she, on the other hand, knows almost everything about She, on the other hand, knows almost everything about their intrigues. As Coburn puts it, oppression sets up a one-way mirror. The oppressed may be invisible to the oppressor, but from the other side, the oppressed have a very clear view of the oppressor. But it is also the case that the potential to be blind is gendered. For the reasons previously discussed, the psychosocial developmental process that men go through ends up with them being better at cutting off, and so they are better able to blind themselves to the humanity of suffering others. Meanwhile, the same process results in women being more in touch with the feeling realm. And consequently, it is more difficult for women to blind themselves to the humanity of suffering others. It is for this sort of reasons that in conflict zones, it tends to be women's collectives that reach out across the divide to other women's collectives to do peace work. As all the foregoing has made clear, at the heart of militarization is the activity of dehumanization. One can even say that military training is a training in how to dehumanize, in who to dehumanize, and why to dehumanize. The purpose of military training is to enable the soldier to be able to kill not just with equanimity, but with a sense of pride. Having dehumanized the other, there is no danger of empathy being triggered, because dehumanized things do not feel pain. As some Israeli women participating in Masham Watch have reported, the women are often told by soldiers at the checkpoints, depriving Palestinians of water, food, and toilets, "Don't worry about them. They don't feel it the way that you or I do." But here is the rub. The only way that I can cut myself off from them is by cutting off my own capacity to feel. In Buber's language, in order to turn thou into an it, I also have to turn myself into an it. And this is the key point. I cannot dehumanize them without dehumanizing myself. And so I become heartless in a land without heart, the war zone. Dehumanized subjects find it easy and natural to attribute all kinds of inhuman convictions to dehumanized objects. It is then possible to say and believe, we know one thing about the Arabs, they're people who don't value life. But surely this is racism. But to the dehumanized subject, racism is not racism, it is realism. Well, I would argue that the function of military training to dehumanize a soldier to be is in effect a corruption of the soul of the soldier to be. When mothers and fathers send their children off to the military, they're not thinking that they're sending them into situations that will corrupt their souls. Instead, they might feel proud or they might feel fear, but they do not imagine that the child that went to the military will never return. Because the one who returns, if they return, will in profound ways be different to the one who left. Thanks. Well, I come to the end now. What of psychotherapy in this kind of militarized context? The feminist line put forward in the first paper, and in particular Lynn Layton's thesis, would say that whatever their particular histories, all men and women coming into therapy will have been damaged by the patriarchal systems that they've been born into. She has called them narcissistic injuries. What the argument of this paper adds is that in militarized contexts, the injury is so deep that it is an injury to our very humanity. The injury is profound as it comprises of a corruption of the soul. All this will be equally true of the therapist. In sum, both therapist and client are gendered, politicized beings. Both are necessarily broken. If therapy is some kind of process that seeks to rehumanize the dehumanized, then it will necessarily be a practice in politics, and it will necessarily also be a practice in ethics. The work will necessitate reconnecting with ethical distress, which is triggered when one is finally able to face tragedy and injustice and know one's place in it. The process is bound to be deeply disturbing, not only to the patient, but also the therapist, because in many ways both are cut from the same cloth. Faced with the reality of injustice, there are two choices. Do something about it, or put the television on. I confess that mostly I put the television on. I think psychotherapy to be a form of activism. To put it another way, and more strongly, to imagine or think that one is practicing a form of psychotherapy that is apolitical is in itself unethical. So to conclude, I give the last sorry. So to conclude, I give the last word to New Profile, the Israeli feminist anti-militarist organization, as it sums up the arguments of these two papers. Militarization turns on maintaining the image of a fearful enemy, thought to understand only force, and on projecting the image of defenseless, passive women and children whose need for protection justifies state violence. The enemy on the one hand, and our women and children on the other, are militarism's others, each serving to sanction the practice of war and the continued supremacy of a masculine elite of fighters.